Will I be able to hear the baby? AJ walked a few paces behind Louis and Clementine as they made their way through Richmond. The afternoon sun shone over the city with a bright yellow hue. This late summer warmth was enveloping them. AJ unzipped his jacket, a small bed of sweat running down his forehead. He checked his watch and nodded. 6 o'clock. Upon seeing the garment, Louis had taught him how to read time, something AJ had never had to do before. It turned out Javi said that it was in description read, "Prove you were here, leave your mark." It was a Garcia family heirloom, passed from a father and son at the age of 11. Since Javier never had kids, he decided AJ should have it. Louis, whose arms was around Clem's waist, turned her head and looked and smiled back at the boy. "Of course," he said, giving AJ a thumbs up. She can hear you too, by the way." "She can?" Louis nodded. "I talk to her all the time," he assured him. "You should too, so she can recognize your voice when she gets here." "And she gonna be here?" AJ inquired. The trio turned around the corner at the end of the street, and AJ spotted a large white tent that served as a makeshift hospital for the town. Since Clem was nearing 6 months in her pregnancy, Eleanor had urged her to go by her office one more time, just to check the baby's vitals. "Just only 3 more months," Clem reminded AJ. They stepped through the door of the tent, sidestepping as a nurse rushed past them. AJ followed the couple inside the aisle. His eyes were darting at every patient and every doctor in the premise. "Well, it's taking a really long time," he complained. Rolling his eyes, he heard Clem and Louis chuckle from ahead. They arrived at the green door at the end of the hall. A red cross was painted over it. Louis knocked twice, stepping back as he opened it, and Eleanor poked her head through the gap. "Oh, great, you made it," she said with a smile. "I'm just finishing up with a patient, and I'll see you in a moment." "Thanks," Louis replied giddily. Leaning against the wall of the door, he looked at Clem up and down, and his eyes landed on her swollen stomach. "I still can't believe you're actually having my baby." "Neither could Violet when I told her," Clem teased, raising an eyebrow at him. Believe her exact words were, "Good luck with that." He rolled his eyes, always such a ray of sunshine, that woman, Louis said. He leaned in, cupping her belly with his hands. "I just can't wait for us to start this chapter of our lives. An awesome ninja family," he commented again with a grin. "Just the 4 of us living happily ever after." "4?" AJ exclaimed with his brows neatly knitted. "Who's the 4th one? Is there going to be another baby?" he inquired, looking up at Clem. She chuckled and shook her head, ruffling his hair. "You're the 4th one, goofball," she assured him. "Oh," he muttered, looking down at his hands. I'd like that." Their conversation was cut short when Eleanor's door swung open, and a middle-aged man stepped out, nodding at the couple as they left. The doctor hushed the trio inside, closing the door behind them. Clem took a seat near at the gunnery. AJ and Louis sat on the other side. Eleanor repeated the process that she's done the first time, applying the weird gel on the stick, and Clem lifted her shirt and flinched when the cold surface touched her skin. A soft thumping sound startled AJ, as he directed his attention to a small screen on the machine where the stick was hooked up to. He inspected it with an interesting, never have seen one before. The black screen turned gray for a second before a ray of white lines appear over the black background. As Clem gasped at the sight of it, AJ leaned in, marveling at the image on the screen. The baby's head was visible on the right. A small body was attached to it. There was numbers that he didn't know the meaning of at the side of the screen, and thumping was ever present. "That's the sound?" he asked Eleanor, and never taking his eyes off of the baby. "That's the baby's heartbeat," she informed him, checking on the screen. 140 BMP. It's growing amazingly. "Wasn't it like 165 the last time we came?" Louis asked with his raised eyebrows. "Is she getting weaker?" Eleanor chuckled, shaking her head. "Around this time in the pregnancy, the fetal resting its heartbeat drops a bit." "This is perfectly normal," he assured the father-to-be. He sighed himself in relief, squeezing Clem's hand softly. AJ was gazing at the screen when it buzzed and it turned to black. Eleanor assured him that she was just turning off the machine when a whirling sound erupted from it, startling the boy. A small paper, much like the one Louis had shown him a few months back, slid out of the shot, and Eleanor handed it to AJ. He examined it, cocking his head towards the side. The previous way lines that were now concealed the silhouette of the small bundle. Its head was on the right side, and its body was resting comfortably on the bottom. He did notice that the thumping sound had also stopped. He handed Louis a picture with a smile on his face. "I can see it!" he exclaimed, bouncing up with the balls of his feet. "That's great, little man," Louis said, giving AJ a high five. Eleanor stepped in, holding up a clipboard in her hands. She cleared her throat and gaining the attention of the trio. "AJ, would you mind giving us a minute? I need to ask Clem and Louis some standard questions." Taken aback, AJ obliged and walked out for the room towards a chair on the far side of the wall. He took a seat and his feet dangling off the edge of it. He looked at the couple for a moment before when they were focused on Eleanor's questioning. Their hands were entwined with it together for the whole thing. He smiled at the sight, his eyes drifting down to his feet. At some point, Eleanor had taken her leave. Giving the couple some space, AJ waited for them to beckon him over, but no invitation was a forthcoming. They were examining the new baby photo again, smile of pure of joy in their faces. Maybe they wanted some time. He was absolutely picking at the chipped paint that coated the zip on his jacket, which is the part that had a reside in his lap. Whisked at the glaze of the drifting across the room at the couple. Clementine was lying down on the gurney on the far side, while Louis sat on the edge holding her hand and whispering softly into her ear, having a conversation he wasn't part of. Her face wrinkled up when she laughed at whatever joke he did, bandaging the nerves and fear that she had about their unborn child. The young boy couldn't help but smile, happy to see that Clementine's spirit had been raised. He had been used to seeing her tired and upset, but it had become the norm. He watched and as she ran her hands across her stomach. AJ traced the baby bump with his eyes, his face turning dull and his smile flattering. Not long now, he often heard her say. It was all she ever talked about him. The baby. He'd been lying if he wasn't excited about the new addition to the family, but what was going to happen when it came? He already felt pushed aside, even more now. He was forgotten. Would this baby take his place? Did Clem think it'd be better than him? It was going to be born into this world, just like him. Why would they be any different? AJ had become so lost in his own head that he didn't hear Louis beckoning him over the third time until the man uttered his name. AJ, come here! The young boy pushed himself off the chair and crossed the office with a curiosity. The baby's kicking. Do you want to feel? Louis asked, his dark brown eyes almost swimming with tears of joy, and a body bursting with brundle excitement. Clementine had held out her hand, offering AJ to help AJ find the right spot. Feeling lightly pressured, but he also a mixture of curiosity and wonder, he lifted his arm. Getting closer, however, the young boy was in touching distance of Clementine. He stopped when he admittedly backed away, distancing himself from the both of them. No thanks, Louis should go first. I'll do it some other time, he murmured, retreating out of the door before they left. The adults could protest, leaving them confused. He absently walked out of the hall, lost in thought. Maybe he should have felt the baby kick. He hoped Clem wasn't too disappointed. He didn't think that he deserved to be the first one to experience something so remarkable. Clem and Louis were in pieces of a puzzle, and over time, it seemed like he didn't fit with them. He felt almost like he didn't belong anymore. Before he could delve any further in his thoughts, he bumped into someone's back. He stood up to apologize and looked up at Gabe standing over him. The man helped AJ up, smiling down at him. Going somewhere, buddy? He asked in his tone cheery. AJ raised his eyebrow, eyeing at Gabe up and down. He was wearing now a hypnotizingly straight shirt, a pair of tight jeans, and his gun holstered to his belt. AJ searched for a reason for being there and came up with empty. I was just going to the bathroom, he mumbled, seeing the door a few paces down the hall. Gabe crosses his arms, nodding. You okay, man? He asked. You seem a little shaken. I don't know, admitted AJ, shrugging. An idea popped into his head at that moment. He looked up at Gabe and tilted his head. You had a sister, didn't you? Taken back the question, Gabe opened his mouth with no words came out, and AJ stared at Gabriel and blinked a few times and mumbled something in Spanish. By the tone of it, AJ gathered it wasn't pleasant. I did, Gabe said, bitterly crossing his eyes. Why do you ask? Do you love her? Of course I did, AJ said, like the most obvious thing in the world. We fought every now and then, but by the end of the day, we loved each other. What about your parents? AJ asked, unable to stop the questions from the following. Did they love her more than you? Gabe frowned at the question, but seemingly reckoning his brain for answers. I guess he did, Gabe asked, shrugging. A new baby is always a joy for everyone in the family, except for their siblings. I remember when Mariana was getting used to the best toys when we were younger. She reminisces it with a smile. What is it about anyway? Gabe asked, leaning against the wall. AJ opened his mouth to answer, but was interrupted by Lewis's hand on his shoulder. He turned around and looked up to see his adoptive father, who wore a concerned expression. You okay, AJ? He asked, kneeling to his level. Something the matter? AJ shook his head. Nope, I'm fine, he assured the man. Thank you. Lewis nodded at the boy and looked up at Gabe. Everything okay? He asked briskly, piercing his lips. Just peachy, Gabe replied, shrugging. The freckled man eyed him curiously for a moment before heading AJ back to the office. AJ looked back at Gabe before entering, the man now giving him a slow wink. Clem asked the same question as Lewis, and AJ gave him the same answer. She looked at him up and down and nodded. Don't run off like that, all right? She said. I won't, he promised with a smirk, winking up at Lewis. The trio then went back to their room in the fervent conversation, discussing about more possible names. Among a bunch of names, Lewis suggested Kayla and Michael as new possibilities. Clem unfortunately dismissed him with a chuckle. As they got into their room, they bid AJ a good night. Clem kneeled down and kissed him profusely on the cheek, leaving him flustered. Clem, get off, he complained, closing his eyes. I can't help it, she claimed, lowering her face into kisses. I've got this new motherly instinct now. You gotta get used to it. He fought her off with a smile and crept under his lip, and despite himself, the boy gave Lewis a hug and opened his door. I love you guys, he said, shuffling his feet. And we love you even more, goofball, Clem said, blowing another kiss, as he smiled back at each other as she closed the door behind them. Lewis and Clem had walked to their bed and helped her lay down, holding out a bit of an arm out to her. When she complained, he raised a hand. No buts. I promised Eleanor you'd be extra careful, he said. But when did she ask you this? She inquired, raising an eyebrow. She unlocked her belt and wiggled out of her jeans, revealing the comfort that she had been lined in the bedspread. After about 5 minutes after she told you the first time, he said with a shrug. Needless to say, she doesn't want you. She wanted you. She didn't want trust you following her own advice. Clem scoffed, but couldn't find any Denny in it. Lewis took off his coat and shirt and placed them gently on the chair beside him and laid back on it, taking hold of the outstretched hand, and was slowly stroking the palm of his hand with his thumb. The couple looked up in the ceiling in silence, basking about each other's company. Soon the sun had finally set, drowning them in the near darkness. As his head rested propped against his right hand, his left hand slid about Clementine's stomach. Clem noticed his adventures and took his hand, suppressing it with a giggle and guiding it towards the right direction. Her belly was already taking its shape. His fingers caressed it gently, making her hum constantly. With some effort, she rolled her eyes towards him. She placed his hand over his heart like she did every night. Its steady thumping smoothed her. She leaned in and planted a small kiss on his cheek. Good night, honey. Sleep well, Clem, he whispered, his eyes already droopy from exhaustion. Just 3 more months, huh? It won't be long now, she agreed, covering his hands with hers. She still stifled a yawn. She's gonna be amazing, Clem breathed as sleep overtook her. After that, the few weeks flew in a haze. Their days have consisted of mostly regular checkups and some mingling with the Richmond community. Clem, for one, was grateful that she didn't have to interact with Lizzie for another minute. Before she realized 2 months had passed, and she and Lewis were in the room getting their rest before their final trip back to the school. According to Eleanor, almost being 8 months pregnant, she said I wouldn't be able to travel at all soon. her feet already sore every day. She woke up at odd times at the nights for cravings of foods they wouldn't proceed to be pouting when she realizes it. To say the least, she all glad that it was almost over, and as she closed her eyes, she was plunged into the darkness with thrown yet another dream, although this one was different than the rest. Her eyes flickered open in the sudden light from an afternoon sun, morbidly blinding her. She looked around as her eyes adjusted to the brightness. A meadow extended in front of her as her left eye could see. A small number of trees were scattered across the field. Their leaves were bright orange, and the grass around there was oddly green, barely any of shorter than an inch of a height. Birds chirped overhead, making her look up, and they flew over in a bright blue sky streaked with small white puffy clouds. The scene was almost pulled out of a drawing. She thought with a smile. A small animal brushed off its fur from her ankles, and it's as if she realized that she was barefoot. Her usual grime-covered jacket had been replaced with a bright orange blouse. She wore tight demi-jeans and a quick inspiration of her head before she still had her hat. Her hands quickly drifted to her abdomen, but something was amiss. Her previous belly was flat. She looked around frantically as if she had somehow walked away from her. Then a whistle came out of nowhere behind her, and she turned. A picnic table had been set in the middle of the clearing, 5 plates of food on it. Sitting on the head of the table was Louis, wearing his signature trench coat. She beaconed over, waving an arm at him. She said hi when she slowly approached the table. As she neared it, she spotted AJ sitting on Louis's right. He was wearing a science dog sweater and a pair of jeans. Unlike his usual state, his clothes weren't matted with dirt and grime either. When did he grow up so much? She thought curiously. The boy absently plunged his fork into the steak plate on the plate and earning a stern look from Louis. You gotta wait, Clem, little dude. He casted. AJ rolled his eyes but obeyed in setting the fork down. It was only that Clementine arrived at the table and she saw a third person sitting on the high chair to Louis's left. She had curly brown hair and was going down to her shoulders, 2 pink bows on either side of her head. Her eyes were deep hazel, inspecting everything on sight. An array of freckles were on her cheek, put to Louis to shame, extending all the way down to her collarbone and beneath the tiny yellow dress. When she spotted Clementine walking their way, her eyes hazel lit up with excitement. She flailed her arms around, almost knocking up the small cup of water Louis had placed her on her high chair. "Mommy, Mommy!" she exclaimed, her small hands reaching for the woman. Clem did a double take and blinked rapidly. "This is my daughter?" she asked herself, taking small steps. She approached a 1-year-old and reached her out of her right hand, with the baby's tiny hand clamped around her index finger, filling Clementine with a surge of warmth that he felt around when Louis or AJ was there. "Hey, honey," she whispered, unable to keep the smile away from settling on her features. She looked up at Louis, who winked. "Lou, now that Mommy's here, we can start," he said, gesturing to Clementine to sit down beside her daughter. "Bon appetit," he added, sticking his fork to the meal. Clem looked down at her plate. Steak was sided with mashed potatoes, and he looked around at her family. Smiling was Louis and AJ, and laughed at some joke her husband did. Their daughter was fidgeting with some sort of mashed potatoes in her hands, smearing most of it on the tray of the high chair attached to it, and on AJ's left side was a 5th plate. It could sense it's still warm. "Whose plate is that for?" she asked suddenly. Louis's eyes glazed up from his food of plate, slapping his forehead. "Oh, crap, I almost forgot," he cursed himself, shaking his head. A deep voice from behind Clem interrupted him, startling the woman. "Hey, Sweet Pea." She swirled into her seat, gasping when she spotted the man that she hadn't seen in over 13 years. His blue shirt and demi pants. Lee stood right in front of her with a fond smile and kind eyes. "Lee?" she stuttered, rubbing her eyes. "Yep, that's me," he joked, leaning down and placing a kiss on her forehead. "Thanks for having me here, by the way," he told Louis with a smirk. As he would round up the table, he took a seat at the 5th chair. Clem never took her eyes off of him. Louis gave him a half shrug. "Sorry, sir, AJ was hungry," he excused himself. "You were too," AJ exclaimed, slapping Louis on the shoulder. Lee chuckled at the exchange. Shaking his head, he dug into his his meal, seemingly enjoying it profusely. As the family ate their meal, Clem just stared at Lee. There was something off about him, and he nodded, although he didn't quite place it. Her mind had raced 1,000 miles around, trying to pinpoint her concern at some point. He looked up at her and raised an eyebrow. "Everything all right, Sweet Pea?" he asked. It clicked. She looked up at the man with sad eyes and her brows neatly knitted. Clem pierced her lips. "I just wish you were here," she said simply. The man frowned at her and blinked twice. "What are you talking about? I am here." "I mean, I wish you were alive," she replied. His face turned to slumber, knowing that passing looked through his features. At that moment, it was that the time had stopped. The birds had stopped chirping, and AJ and Louis sat motionless. Their meals were getting colder by the second, and her daughter stared blankly at Lee, her hazel eyes just still at the sight of joy and fantasy. He looked at the baby for a moment, and a smile passing through his lips, and despite himself. "She's very cute," he complimented, glancing at Clem. "What's her name?" "We haven't decided on one yet," Clem answered, shrugging. "I like Diana, though," she added, pushing a strand of curls from her daughter's face. "Great name," Lee said, nodding. They sat for a silence in a moment before looking at the table. "It's been a while," he said after a while. "It sure has," she agreed, nodding. "I never imagined you as a mother, but seeing that you have done for Alvin Jr. here, I'm sure you'll do a great job." He reached out for her at the table, their hands entwining. Clem squeezed it, frowning. "It's been so hard without you," she admitted, looking up at to his eyes. "I can't imagine what you've been through, Clementine." He stood up suddenly, rounding up the table while placing a hand on her shoulder. She turned to him, tears swelling in her amber eyes. She opened up her mouth, able to speak, but her voice was gone. Emotion took over. Her arms immediately with scrape wrapped around his waist. Tears flew down her cheeks, and he draped his arms around her, resting his chin on her head. "It's all right, Sweet Pea." "I'm scared, Lee," she whimpered, her eyes closed tight. "You don't have to be scared, Clem," he assured her. She felt as if her embraces softened and looked up at him. He was fading away, his smile was ever present on his face. "Just be yourself and you'll be fine." She hugged Lee tighter, her grasp on his shirt was loosening as he disappeared into thin air. Her breathing became more hitched and she sobbed into the air. The bright blue sky seemed to be mocking her emotions as the birds started singing again. Her eyes were just still shut, as if a wave of wind had blew past her, startling her. Suddenly she was plunged back into the darkness for a second. She couldn't find her bearings, floating into a void without a warning. She felt her back hit something, and she was lying on her bed. Her breathing was ragged, and small beads of sweat ran down her forehead. Clem sat up, leaning against the headboard. She rubbed her eyes, closing her eyes tightly, as that was the first thing she dreamed about at least sometime. Beside her, Louis was snoring gently, his mouth agape as he dreamt. His eyelids moved to his eyes, darting away from side to side. She smiled at him and running her hand down his forehead, brushing a few dreadlocks off of it. The moonlight was still shining through the windows, casting odd shadows in the bedside tables. Getting up with some effort, he slipped on a pair of sweatpants and walked towards the door. Slowly closing it from behind, she stepped out into the hallway. The hallway was beyond deserted, a soft breeze blowing past her slowly. She walked through it, and her mind full of troubled thoughts, when she turned around the corner, and she was startled to see a figure hunched over in the steps of the staircase. She didn't make it out who it was until she slowly approached him. When she placed her hand on her shoulder, they turned and grinned. "Didn't expect company this time of night."